Inside the glass-walled command office, where every worker on the floor below could see but not hear, Claudia Reeves folded her hands and spoke without warmth. "Do what I say, or clear out your desk." Elijah Brooks did not argue. He did not beg. He did not raise his voice. He only looked at her for a long moment, then asked one quiet question. "You'll put that in writing." Something in her face went sharp and still. She said nothing. He nodded as if that silence had told him everything he needed to know. Then he closed his laptop, gathered his things, and walked out. The entire plant fell dead quiet behind him. Why would a man dare to walk away when he was the only thing holding his family together? What had she asked him to do? And why did the word writing make a powerful woman go pale? For 11 years, Elijah Brooks had walked the same stretch of concrete floor at Halverson Manufacturing, and in all that time, the men and women who ran the line beside him had learned one thing about him. Above everything else, the man kept records the way other people kept faith. If a machine needed a new part, he wrote it down. If a shift ran long, he logged the hours before anyone had to ask. When a supervisor promised a bonus in the break room, Elijah would smile and say in that even voice of his that he'd love to see it in an email. Some of the younger workers found it tiresome. They called him the paperwork man behind his back and sometimes to his face, and he took the nickname the way he took most things without offense. He had reasons he did not explain. He simply believed that a thing written down could not be twisted later, and a thing spoken aloud could vanish the moment it became inconvenient. He carried that same steadiness into the way he managed people. He was the floor manager who knew without checking exactly how long each person under him had worked there, and precisely how many months stood between them and the milestones that mattered, the anniversaries, where health coverage kicked in, where pensions vested, where a temporary badge became a permanent one. He knew these dates because he considered it his job to know them, and because he had watched years ago what happened to people whose dates were forgotten by everyone but themselves. Outside the plant, his life was smaller than his paycheck would have allowed. He drove a sedan old enough that the paint had gone chalky at the edges, and he lived in a narrow house on a quiet street where the mortgage had long since become the least of his worries. He did not travel. He did not replace things that still worked. His son Marcus was 13 and did not always understand this, and lately understood it less and less. The boy had reached the age where other kids' shoes and phones had become a language he could not speak, and he watched his father count change at the grocery register and felt something that was almost shame, though he would not have called it that. "Other dads don't do this," Marcus said once, sliding into the passenger seat of the old car while a newer one pulled out beside them. "Other dads aren't your dad," Elijah answered, and left it there because the full answer was not something a 13-year-old was ready to carry. The woman who ran Halverson from the top floor was a different kind of person entirely. Claudia Reeves had built her career on a single conviction, one she repeated often enough that it had become a kind of company scripture. Everyone, she believed, had a string that could be pulled. Everyone had something they were more afraid of losing than they were willing to admit. Her talent, and she considered it a talent, was finding that string before she ever walked into a room. She did not make demands blindly. She studied people first. She read their files, learned the shape of their debts, their families, their fears, and only then did she ask for what she wanted, because a request made to a frightened person was rarely refused. Her office was a box of glass suspended above the production floor, and from it she could watch every worker in the building while none of them could hear a word she said. She liked it that way. She believed transparency was a thing you offered downward and never upward. It was in that glass office on an ordinary Thursday that she called Elijah Brooks up from the floor and asked him to do something she had already decided he would agree to. The task was simple to describe and difficult to survive. There was a group of workers, 9 of them, who were approaching the marks on the calendar that turned a company's promises into a company's obligations. Some were weeks from their pensions vesting. 2 were a single month from the coverage that would pay for a wife's treatment, a daughter's surgery. Claudia Reeves wanted them gone before those dates arrived. Not laid off in some clean, lawful reduction, removed deliberately on paper, dressed up to look like performance-timed so that the company would never owe them the thing they had spent years earning. She did not use ugly words for it. She spoke of efficiency, of hard decisions, of the numbers the board expected. She framed it as trust. She was giving this to Elijah because he was the one man on the floor the workers believed in, and if the cuts came from him, they would come quietly. Elijah listened to all of it without moving. When she finished, he asked the same kind of question he always asked. "You'll give me that in writing. The names, the timeline, the reason." The temperature in the glass room seemed to drop. Claudia Reeves did not write things down that could be read back to her later, and they both knew it. Her refusal when it came was smooth and certain, and it told Elijah more than any confession could have. A person only refuses to put something in writing when they already understand exactly how wrong it is. "I don't need a memo to know what my company needs," she said. "I need a manager who understands his position." "I understand it," he said. "Then we understand each other." "No, ma'am." His voice never rose. "I don't think we do." She let the silence sit the way she always did, waiting for the string to go taut. She had read his file. She knew about the old car and the small house and the boy, and she had drawn from all of it the conclusion that this was a man with everything to lose and no cushion beneath him. She believed she had found his string, and she pulled it. "Think carefully," she said. "You're a single father. You have no savings to speak of, no soft landing. Men in your position don't get to have principles. They get to have jobs. Do what I've asked or clear out your desk." And here was the thing she had gotten wrong, the thing her research had never uncovered, because it was the kind of truth a man keeps off every file. Elijah Brooks was not standing at the edge she thought he was standing at. He had spent 11 years making sure he would never have to. He stood up. He did not slam anything. He gathered the few things that were his, and he left everything that belonged to the company exactly where it should be. His files squared, his logs complete. Nothing deleted, nothing hidden, as though he wanted the record to stay clean and whole for whoever came looking. From the floor below, dozens of faces turned upward through the glass, watching a conversation they could not hear end in a way none of them expected. He walked out of the office. He walked down the metal stairs. He crossed the floor he had crossed for over a decade, past the machines and the people he knew by name, and he did not look back at the woman still standing behind the glass, certain he would return. She was certain because her whole philosophy required it. A man with a string always came back once you pulled it. She would spend the coming weeks learning how badly she had misjudged the length of that string, and how much a person can prepare in silence for a single moment he has seen coming for years. Because the thing that stunned the entire plant that afternoon was not that a man had been given an impossible choice. People were given impossible choices all the time. What stunned them was the calm. There was no fear in the way he closed that door. There was no desperation in his walk. He moved like a man who had already made this decision a long time ago and was only now at last being asked to act on it. And that is the quiet lesson standing at the start of this story before any of the truth had surfaced. The thing that unsettles people most is rarely the size of a decision. It is the steadiness of the person making it, the particular calm that belongs only to someone who prepared long before anyone was watching for the day they would have to choose. The story of what happened next did not begin with Elijah Brooks. It began with the woman who was sure he would come back. Claudia Reeves did not chase people. That was beneath her, and besides, it was unnecessary. In her experience, a man who walked out in anger walked back in humility within a week, once the fear he had been running on cooled into arithmetic. So she waited. She had, after all, done the math on Elijah Brooks before she ever called him into the glass office, and the math had told her a simple story. She knew the age of his car. She knew the size of his mortgage and the fact that he carried it alone. She knew there was a boy 13 years old who ate breakfast every morning on the strength of a single paycheck, and she knew there was no second income behind that paycheck, no wife, no family money, no visible reserve. To a woman who read people the way other people read weather, all of it added up to a man standing at the edge of a cliff with a child on his back. Such a man did not jump. Such a man, she believed, could be made to do almost anything if you simply reminded him how far down the fall would be. She had reminded him. That was what the last words in the glass office had been for. "You're a single father," she had told him in the voice she saved, for the moment a string went taut. "You have no savings to speak of, no soft landing. Men in your position don't get to have principles." She had watched those words land, or believed she had, and she had let him leave the way you let a fish run with the line certain of the hook. There is a thing worth saying here quietly before the days start to pass, because it sits underneath everything Claudia Reeves believed and everything she was about to get wrong. Power in a workplace rarely announces itself with a threat. It almost never begins with a raised voice or a pointed finger. It begins earlier and quieter than that. In the moment someone learns precisely what you are most afraid of losing: the job, the coverage, the roof, the child's next meal, and files it away for the day they might need it. The heaviest chain a person ever wears is not the one another person forges. It is the one made of their own dependence, worn so long they have stopped noticing the weight. Claudia Reeves had spent a career locating that dependence in other people. It had never once occurred to her that a man might spend his own career quietly filing his chains off link by link so that when the day came, there would be nothing left for her to pull. The first week passed. Elijah did not call. She told herself this was pride, and pride was patient, but not infinite. The second week passed. His desk on the floor stayed empty, and the workers who had watched that silent conversation through the glass began to ask questions she did not answer. Still, she was not worried, not truly. A man could hold out for 2 weeks. A mortgage could not. But somewhere in the third week, the certainty in her began to curdle into something else, because Elijah Brooks did not behave like a man being slowly starved back to her table. He did not appear at the gate asking for his position. He did not send some carefully worded message testing whether the door was still open. He simply was not there in a way that felt less like absence and more like decision. He had not fled her. He had removed himself cleanly the way he removed himself from any transaction he did not intend to be part of, and the completeness of it began to unsettle her in a way she could not name. What she did not know, what none of them knew yet, was what had actually been asked in that glass office, and why the man's first and only question had been about writing. He had understood the shape of it before she finished speaking. The 9 names were not a random cut. They were a schedule. Every one of those workers stood within weeks of a date on the calendar that would turn the company's long promises into the company's legal debts. Pensions about to vest, coverage about to begin, a permanent badge about to replace a temporary one. Claudia Reeves had not asked Elijah to lay people off. Layoffs were lawful and ordinary, and cost money in severance and settlement. She had asked him to remove those 9 specific people just before their earned benefits came due, dressed as performance time to the day, so that a decade of somebody's work would evaporate the week before it finally paid out. And she had asked for it out loud in a glass room with nothing on paper, because a woman who put such a thing in writing was a woman handing someone else the knife. That was why he had asked, and that was why he had gone. At home in the narrow house on the quiet street, Marcus asked the question the whole plant was asking, though the boy asked it with more hurt in it. "You just left them," Marcus said one evening, not looking up from his plate. He had heard things. Kids always heard things. "The guys on your line. Everybody's saying you walked out and left them to get cut." Elijah set down his fork. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the old refrigerator working somewhere behind them. "If I stand up in that building today and tell people what she asked me to do," he said finally, "what happens, it's my word against hers, a floor manager against the woman who signs everyone's checks. I lose, and they still get cut, and now I've spent the one thing I had to spend and gotten nothing for it." He looked at his son. Some things you can't stop by shouting at them while they're still just words in a room. You have to let them become real. You have to let somebody actually do the thing, because a thing that gets done leaves marks. A thing that only gets said doesn't leave anything at all. Marcus did not fully understand it, but he heard underneath the words that his father had not run from anything, that the leaving had been a kind of waiting, and the waiting had a purpose he was not yet allowed to see. To understand why Elijah Brooks lived the way he lived, the old car, the small house, the careful ledger of every promise anyone ever made him, you have to go back further than Halverson to a man whose name Elijah still spoke with care, a machinist named Walter Prine. Years before, at a different plant, Elijah had been young and new and eager, and Walter had been the steady older hand who taught him how the work was really done. Walter was good at the machine, good to the people around him, the kind of man who covered a co-worker's mistake without making him feel small. And when management there decided to cut a corner that would have hurt people down the line, they did not order it in writing either. They leaned on Walter quietly, because Walter had a sick wife and a stack of bills and no room in his life to say no. They found his string and they pulled it, and Walter did the thing they asked because he could not afford not to. And when it went wrong, as such things do, they needed a name to hang it on. It was not going to be theirs. It was Walter's word against the men above him, and Walter had nothing, no memo, no email, no record of who had actually told him to do it. He had only his own account, and his account was worth less than theirs. And everyone in that building understood, without anyone saying it aloud, whose account was always going to be worth less. Walter was pushed out in disgrace for doing what he had been ordered to do, and there was not a single piece of paper anywhere that told the truth of it. Elijah had watched it happen and had been able to do nothing because a young man with no savings and no evidence is a witness nobody has to hear. He never forgot the two things that had destroyed Walter Prine. Walter had been trapped because he needed the money too badly to refuse, and Walter had been erased because he had nothing in writing to prove what had really been asked of him. So Elijah built his whole quiet life around never being trapped by either one. He would keep enough money set aside that no employer could ever own him through fear of an empty refrigerator, and he would keep a record of everything, every promise, every order, every date, so that no one could ever rewrite what had truly happened, and leave him standing alone with only his word, a word that certain people had already decided in advance to disbelieve. The old car and the small house were not poverty. They were armor. The paperwork was not a quirk. It was a vow. Every strange, small habit the plant had teased him for suddenly had a shape. Meanwhile, Claudia Reeves stopped waiting for Elijah Brooks to come back and started looking for someone to replace him. She found a man named Trent Dooley, an ambitious supervisor 2 rungs down, who had watched Elijah's empty office and seen not a warning but an opening. Trent did not ask for anything in writing. Trent did not ask questions at all really beyond what the promotion paid. When Claudia explained in the careful language of efficiency and hard decisions which 9 names needed to be gone and by which dates, Trent nodded and understood the assignment, and understood too that understanding it was how a man moved up in the world. And so the thing was done. Over the following weeks, one by one, the 9 were let go, each of them written up for reasons that looked almost plausible on paper, each of them released on a date that fell with a precision no honest process would ever produce, just short of the milestone that would have cost the company real money. The machinist weeks from his pension. The woman a month from the coverage her husband needed. All of them out, all of them stripped of the thing they had spent years earning, all of it signed and dated and entered into the company's own systems by a newly promoted supervisor who had been too hungry to ask why. To everyone on the floor, it looked like the simplest story in the world. Elijah Brooks had walked out and saved himself, and the men he left behind had been cut down without him. The paperwork man, the one who was supposed to be fair, had turned out to be just another person who protected his own skin when it mattered. Some of them said it plainly. Others just stopped saying his name with warmth. In the space of a month, he went from the manager everyone trusted to the coward who ran, and there was no one to correct the story because the one person who could correct it had chosen on purpose to say nothing at all. He had lost his job. Now he lost the thing that had taken him 11 years to build his name in that building, the respect of people he had known for a decade. Nobody believed him because he had given them nothing to believe. Nobody stood beside him because, as far as anyone could see, he had abandoned them first. A man can survive being wronged. It is a harder thing to survive being misunderstood by the very people you are trying to protect while you hold your silence and let them think the worst. And here in the lowest stretch of it is a thing worth sitting with for a moment. The hardest part of what Elijah carried was not that people had gotten him wrong. He could have borne being wrong in their eyes if he'd had no way to fix it. The hardest part was knowing that he could fix it, that at any moment he could open his mouth and explain himself and be understood again, be liked again, be trusted again, and choosing every single day not to. Because the thing that mattered more had not yet finished happening. And if he spoke too soon to save his own name, he would lose everything the silence was for. There is a particular loneliness in holding a truth you are allowed to speak and choosing not to because the right moment has not come. It asks more of a person than being wronged ever does. What none of them could see, not the workers who stopped saying his name, not Trent Dooley signing his way up the ladder, not Claudia Reeves watching from behind her glass, satisfied at last that she had read the situation correctly, was that the very moment everything looked most like Elijah Brooks's total defeat was the exact moment he had been waiting for from the beginning, because the crime had finally been committed. Not spoken, not threatened, committed. 9 deliberate terminations, each one dated. Each one entered into the company's own records, each one falling just short of a benefit that a manager named Elijah Brooks happened to know the precise timing of better than anyone alive. The thing that only he had refused to do had now been done by someone else in writing in the system in a pattern too clean to be an accident. The order that had left no marks had at last left marks, and they were exactly the marks he had refused to make himself refused, so that someday he could stand across from them and prove they were real. Some things cannot be seen for what they are in the moment they happen. A silence looks like cowardice. A withdrawal looks like abandonment. The lowest point looks like the end. They only reveal their true shape later when enough time has passed for consequences to answer the questions that people in the heat of the moment could only guess at. What looked like a man losing everything was a man letting a trap finish closing patiently at terrible cost to his own name around the people who had built it. For weeks, the story in the plant had one shape, and only one shape. Elijah Brooks had saved himself and left 9 people to fall. It held that shape right up until the morning Elijah walked into a state labor office and filed a formal complaint, and the shape of everything began to change. The complaint was the second of the 2 things Elijah Brooks had spent 11 years quietly building, and to understand it, you have to understand the first. The first was the money. All those years of the chalky old car and the narrow house, the trips never taken, and the things never replaced, the change counted at the register. While his son looked away in embarrassment, none of it had ever been poverty. It had been a fund built one refused luxury at a time for a single purpose. Elijah had called it privately his walk-away money, and its entire reason for existing was so that on the day an employer finally asked him to trade his conscience for his paycheck, he could say no and mean it. It was the thing that had let him stand up in the glass office and leave without his voice shaking because he had made certain over 11 patient years that Claudia Reeves could threaten his refrigerator all she liked and never actually reach it. The money was why he could afford to walk away. But money only buys a man the freedom to leave. It does not by itself win anything. It could not give 9 people back their pensions. It could not clear his name. It could not touch the woman behind the glass. For that he had built the second thing, and the second thing was the record. For 11 years, the plant had teased the paperwork man for logging what did not need logging, for wanting things in writing, for knowing every worker's dates by heart. What none of them had understood was that a floor manager, in the ordinary and lawful course of his own job, sees a great deal and is entitled to keep his own careful account of it. Elijah knew to the day when each of those 9 workers crossed the lines that turned the company's promises into the company's debts, because tracking those dates had always been part of his work. He could not on his own reach into the company's systems after he was gone. But he did not need to. What he brought to the labor office was his own dated timeline of every one of those 9 milestones laid out plainly alongside a single specific allegation that each of these workers had been fired in the narrow window just before their benefits came due, and that the pattern was deliberate. That allegation was the key that turned the lock. A complaint that precise, backed by a manager's own records, was enough to give the investigators grounds to do the one thing Elijah could not do himself: pull the company's internal files. And when they did, the company's own signed and dated terminations dropped neatly onto his timeline and told a story no explanation could talk its way out of. 9 firings, 9 milestones. Every single termination falling in the narrow window before the money came due. Once was an accident. 9 times to the week was a design. The money was why he could walk away. The record was why he could win, not because he had smuggled out a stack of evidence, but because he had known exactly where the evidence would be and exactly how to make the right people go and find it. 2 separate things built for 2 separate purposes, and only now did anyone understand that the strange, frugal, over-documented life of Elijah Brooks had been an instrument the whole time waiting for someone to finally play it. After that, the collapse came quickly, the way things do once the first true thing is finally spoken aloud. The investigators pulled the company's records and found exactly what the timeline promised they would find. Trent Dooley, confronted with his own signature on 9 dated pages, discovered that the promotion he had been so hungry for had made him the only name attached to the crime that Claudia Reeves had once again arranged for someone else to hold the knife, and that this time, the someone was him. He talked. Men who signed things without asking why tend to once they understand what they signed. And when he talked, the last space between the crime and the woman who had ordered it closed. The workers on the floor learned the truth the same way they had learned the lie all at once and from each other. The man they had spent a month calling a coward had not run from them. He had refused the very order that would have cut them, had lost his job for refusing it, and had then stood in the wreckage of his own reputation and said nothing on purpose so that the trap would close on the people who set it instead of springing early and empty. Every unkind thing they had said about him rearranged itself in their memory into something that made them ashamed. Some of them came to the narrow house on the quiet street to say so. They stood on his small porch, men and women who had known him for a decade and had believed the worst of him for a month, and they did not fully know how to apologize for that. Elijah did not make them find the words. He shook their hands and told them he understood why they'd thought what they'd thought, because from where they had been standing, it had looked exactly like what they thought it was. That was the whole point of it, he said. It had to look that way or it wouldn't have worked. The last person to come to the house was Claudia Reeves. She came alone in a car worth more than the house she parked it in front of, and she sat for a moment behind the wheel, looking at the driveway, at the modest windows, at the narrow life she had studied on paper and been so certain she understood. She had built an entire career on one conviction, that every person alive wears a string, and that the work of power is simply finding it and pulling. She had pulled Elijah Brooks's string in the glass office with total confidence, naming his son and his mortgage and his lack of any soft landing, and she had watched him walk out anyway. It had taken her weeks to understand what she was looking at now, sitting in the driveway of it. This man had no string for her to pull. Not because he had been born without the ordinary fears, but because he had spent 11 deliberate years cutting every one of them off, saving the money, so no threat to his livelihood could move him, keeping the record so no lie about him could stand. The old car, The small house that counted change, she had read all of it as weakness, as the very edge she could push him over. It had been the opposite. It had been the reason he could not be pushed at all. The change she had spent a career learning to find in other people, this man had simply refused for over a decade to wear. When he came to the door, she did not lead with an apology because women like Claudia Reeves rarely know how to begin with one. She led with an offer. His job back at a better title, more money than he had ever made on that floor. A clean slate quietly arranged with the unpleasantness behind them. Elijah listened to all of it the way he had listened to her in the glass office months before, without moving, without heat, letting her finish. "No," he said when she was done. She had been prepared for anger and found none, and that was somehow worse. She asked him what he wanted then, because in her world, every refusal was only a negotiation for a higher price. "I don't want the money," he said. "I don't want the title. I want one rule written into how this company runs that outlives both of us. That any worker in that building can refuse an order they know is wrong, refuse it out loud on the record, and keep their job while it gets looked into. So that the next person who's asked to do what you asked me to do doesn't have to be able to afford to say no." She understood, standing on that small porch, that he was not describing something abstract. He was describing the thing that would have saved a machinist named Walter Prine years ago, a man she had never heard of, who had been destroyed precisely because he could not afford to refuse, and had nothing in writing to prove what he'd been asked. Elijah did not explain that to her. He only asked for the rule, and the asking was enough. In the weeks that followed, the wreckage was set right piece by piece, though setting it right is quieter work than tearing it down and makes far less noise. The 9 workers were brought back and made whole, their benefits restored as though the gap in them had never been carved. The process that had let a single dated signature erase a decade of someone's earning was rebuilt so it could not happen the same way again. And the rule Elijah had asked for was written down, a real policy in the real handbook, protecting any worker who refused an unlawful order from being quietly removed for it. Claudia Reeves signed it herself, which was its own kind of ending. A woman putting into permanent writing the one thing she had spent a career refusing to put into writing at all. She was not in the end ruined in the way stories sometimes demand, but she was changed, and the change was the part that mattered. The conviction she had carried her whole life that everyone has a string had met one man who had spent 11 years proving it false, and a belief like that, once it breaks, does not quite reassemble. She ran the company differently afterward, more carefully, as though there might always be somewhere on her floor another person keeping a quiet and honest record of what she asked of people. Elijah did not become anyone's hero. There was no article in the paper, no moment where a crowd said his name. That was not the shape of him, and never had been. He simply became, in the memory of the people who had worked beside him, a quiet example of something they could not quite put into a sentence. The man who had been right when it cost him everything to be right, and who had never once asked to be thanked for it. Years later, long after the particulars had faded, the rule he had asked for was still in that handbook, still doing its silent work, still protecting people who would never know the name of the man who had traded his own good name to put it there. The last of it belongs to the boy. Marcus had spent years not understanding his father, the counted change, the old car, the birthdays where other kids got more. He had felt sometimes something close to shame sliding low in the passenger seat while newer cars pulled away beside them. He understood it now. He had watched a month of the whole town believing his father was a coward, and he had watched that month end with those same people standing on their porch, unable to meet his father's eyes for the shame of what they had believed. He had learned what the small house and the plain years had really been for. They had been the thing that let a good man say no. That spring, Marcus was given an assignment at school, the ordinary kind, to write about someone he admired. He did not write about anyone famous. He wrote a short thing in the plain and certain way of a boy who has finally understood something, and the first line of it was the line his teacher read twice. "The richest man I know is my dad." He did not mean money, and anyone who read it understood that because by then, everyone knew the man drove a car with the paint gone chalky at the edges and lived in a narrow house on a quiet street. The boy had simply learned what his father had known all along, that there are things that never show up in an account, and the ability to keep your conscience on the hardest day of your life is chief among them. One evening, not long after Elijah walked out to the driveway with Marcus beside him. He got into the old sedan, the same one that had embarrassed his son for years, and it started the way it always had on the first turn of the key, faithful and unglamorous. He looked over at the boy in the passenger seat, and for the first time in a long while, there was nothing between them that needed explaining. He smiled, put the car in gear, and drove them both down the quiet street and away. There are assets that never appear in any account, and this whole story had been about the largest of them, the ability to hold on to your own conscience on the day the price of keeping it is everything you have. That is a wealth no one can freeze, garnish, or take, and the man behind the wheel had spent 11 years making sure he would always be able to afford it. Because in the end, the thing that lasts longest is never the title or the paycheck. Those change hands get taken, get signed away by ambitious men who never ask why. What lasts is the way a person chooses to act in the one moment when no one else can make the choice for them, and whether when that moment finally comes, they have quietly made themselves free enough to choose well.